Hello there. Now I'll be posting this video on Thursday the 5th of December, and this is the official release date for the paperback of my novel Hill 112, a novel about D-Day and the Battle for Normandy as seen through the eyes of 3 young British soldiers. And there are various other videos in the playlist that will tell you more about the story, the approach, the research and all this sort of thing. But today I thought I'd do something a little bit different. When I first wrote the novel, I included an epilogue that talked about what happened to the characters after the war, to the end of the war, because the novel finishes in July 1944. This is a little bit slightly later than that, but basically the bulk of the action is in June and July. And then what happened to them afterwards. Now, I quite liked what I'd written, and it was important for me to have a sense of what happened to the characters. But the more I thought about it when I was submitting the manuscript to my publishers, before I actually did that, I spoke to 1 or 2 people, got their opinions, but in the end I decided that there's an essential problem. If you write this fictional epilogue that covers then decades after a novel that's focused very much on a few weeks of the lives of these young men, we have to remember that they're not real people. So they didn't go on to have lives. Now you could say they didn't actually have the experiences that they go through in the novel itself when I'm talking about the landings in Normandy and the fighting afterwards into the bocage, and of course the culminating the story, some of the heaviest fighting around Hill 112. So in a sense you're imagining everything else, and it takes away, should people care really? In one respect the novel is about Normandy, and it's my attempt to convey as strong a sense of what it was like for the individuals involved as I'm able to do as someone who's from a different generation who wasn't there. This is based upon my research and listening to people, hearing people as I grew up when there was still quite a lot of veterans around, and then reading for, well, even I was going to say all my adult life, but actually for longer than that, because I've been fascinated since I was a small boy. So in the end I decided not to do it. So the novel finishes with Bill Judd going to the regimental aid post, being doped out and then sent back to the battalion, and that's it. We don't know what happens to him afterwards. Now, one thing I would say, because I'm going to read you this epilogue that I wrote, for those who are interested, for those who feel they'd like some sense of what happened afterwards, this is my take, this is what I think, but frankly, I mean, we could see this as sort of director's cut of the novel or whatever it might be, but you're free. The novel as published that's I think the best version of it. You're free to imagine what you would like as far as you want to about what happened, but I would say for those who haven't yet read the novel but think they might, probably don't watch the rest of this video until you've done so, unless you like the idea of, obviously this will tell you who survives and in what state to some extent, and by implication who does not. Now that can spoil the surprise, and I've tried to make throughout the story give a sense that we don't actually know whether our characters are going to make it or not. That's the main 3, but also everybody around them, because lots of other people come to figure quite heavily. So anyway, so this is my imagined version. It's only a few pages long of what happened afterwards, of the rest of their lives, in the sense of the survivors and some of the other characters who make it through and who reappear. So, as I say, haven't read the story yet and think you might, then probably best not to. I thought it was one of those things, I had the idea in mind from the beginning that round about the time, I thought either maybe when the novel came out, or let's see, maybe the paperback, or at some point I would post the text of this on my website, which I'll do. Hopefully it should be up by the time you're watching this. And I'd also thought, well, maybe I'll do a video on it as well. So this is my take on what happened next. But for those of you who don't care or aren't really interested, then no sense in listening. For those of you who haven't read the book yet, maybe wait until you have, if you think you're going to, rather than spoil some of the aspects. Now, it ties in slightly differently to the end, because I altered the last paragraph or so of the final chapter when I decided against including this. But anyway, this is our epilogue. At the aid post, Judd had sat down and then fallen asleep. When he woke, the MO gave him a shot and he slept some more. They kept him back with the rear echelon for a couple of days, by which time he was desperate to get back to Rusty Reed and 9 Platoon, knowing that if he did not go soon, then he would not be able to go, whatever threats we used to force him. They let him, for replacements were hard to come by, and he fought through the last weeks of the Normandy campaign and beyond. He and Reed stayed together, and at the end of the war they were the only 2 men left in 9 Platoon from the ones who'd landed on gold. There was only one other in all of A Company who had also been there throughout. They were not quite friends, for Reed was not a man to make a real friend, but they trusted each other and depended on each other. Rusty Reed was not suited to peace. The Glamorgans did their best. They tried to keep him with them as a sergeant until his demob came, but he drank and fought, and eventually his campaign against the military police brought the inevitable end. He was busted and given a year in the glasshouse. Judd was a civilian before his old sergeant. Peace was strange for Bill Judd, and he was not altogether sure that he liked it, much like his demob suit, which did not fit him at all, and he doubted could ever have fitted any human man. Certainly he did not know what to do. He drifted from job to job, not settling. There were girls, but no one serious. Civilian life seemed rather drab and petty, and so very pointless compared to the simplicity of the war. He went home and helped care for his aging mother, whose health was failing. Sometimes he had nightmares. All were of Normandy. James found the change easier, perhaps because he spent so long in hospital that he was eased back into civilian life more gradually. His regiment, the 165th RAC, was disbanded at the end of July, the remaining men sent to other armoured units. In the 5th year of war, Britain was simply running out of men. Somehow, the knowledge that there was no regiment continuing in his absence also helped. James never felt that he was letting anyone down. In September 1945, James married Penny. They had waited because he wanted to be sure that she had not changed her mind. He was well, but his leg would always be stiff, and never again would they dance as once they had danced. There was also something so optimistic at the thought of starting a new life with the war behind them, even though the rationing remained. Bill Judd was at the service in the Anglican church up on the headland. He wore his uniform and was on leave, for his discharge was yet to come through. Penny had not changed her mind, although she found her fiancé strange when he first came back. Yet she was still in love, and soon loved this new James as much as the idealized James of the past. He rather let himself be swept along with it all, because it was expected of him, because he felt that he owed her. 18 months into the marriage, it came to him that he loved her too, as he had never loved anyone or anything before. He never wavered from that opinion. James was lucky, as he had so often been. For a while he worked for Mr. Stevens, and then on a trip to London bumped into an old friend from boarding school who worked at the BBC. They had lunch and talked, and at the end of it James was offered a job. It was vague, but he took the chance, and he and Penny moved to London even though she was expecting their first child. James did odds and ends and learned about the new wonder of television. In time he became a producer and writer and dabbled with directing. He never wrote the great novel he had once dreamed about, and indeed refused to write or make anything serious at all. The war had cured him of wanting to explore the darkness of the human condition, and all he ever wished to do was celebrate life and joy. He was responsible for a lot of popular shows, and did well, spending the rest of his working life with the corporation. At work and everywhere else, he always carried his lady's favour with him when he was starting any new project. By the standards of show business, this was a minor eccentricity, not that anyone ever knew. Unlike many, his eye never wandered, nor did his devotion to Penny waver. Judd lost touch with James over the years, but the big change in his life came when he saw Anne again. Her American had died in March 1945, when his B-24 burst a tyre on takeoff, and the 4-engined bomber, overloaded with bombs and fuel, had crashed on the tarmac and exploded. Anne never married, and when she left the Wren she had gone to Cambridge to read chemistry. There were not many women in the field at the time, but her forceful personality had been honed to a razor's edge in the Navy, and she let nothing get in her way. Eventually, she went to Swansea University to teach there and did a great deal to build up the department. Anne liked being by the sea, and she loved the enthusiasm of a place filled with the young starting out in the world. Once again it was a chance meeting, one Christmas back home, that brought Judd and Anne together, and if chance seems false and has the convenience of fiction, then that is true of so much of life. They became good friends again, although never more, and she cajoled him and convinced the university to let him study even though he was in his 30s by this time. He read history and loved every minute, even if the other undergraduates seemed so much like infants. Afterwards he became a teacher and loved that too, going to the grammar school in his hometown. At the age of 39 he fell in love and married within a few months. She was also a teacher, and the two seemed unlike in every regard except that they made each other happy. They attended the local chapel, and when children came along, Judd found himself running a Sunday school and a youth club as well as his ordinary job. He took a particular pleasure in the awkward ones who asked the awkward questions. His own faith was simple, for he no longer wanted to worry about the deep things or challenge every idea. He decided that he wanted to believe in God and salvation, so did so, enough to satisfy his wife with her deeper faith. He also believed in people. For all the cruelty and destruction he had seen in the war, he had seen so much good and kindness and courage, often in unlikely places. Judd felt that he came to understand why there was so much good reason for saving mankind. Even so, he rarely felt comfortable around the rest of the congregation and found most of his friends elsewhere. All were former servicemen, who seemed to understand better without having to discuss it all. Yet at heart he remained a loner, happy only with his family. Judd saw Reed a couple of times and even got him a job with a delivery company for a short while. Rusty was fired when he was late one day and punched the manager who told him off. The reason for the delay was that he had stopped to help an old man hit by a car, but he had not bothered to tell anyone that. Rusty Reed fought his way through peace, just as he had fought his way through the war, and the civilian world did not do much to accommodate him. He drank, far more than ever before, and it did not help. He was arrested and imprisoned several times. In January 1961 he was found dead in an alley in Macclesfield. He had passed out from drink and died in his sleep. His landlady wrote to Judd because his was the only name and address she could find among Reed's meagre things. Judd sent her £3.10 to make up for the arrears of rent. That was a lot of money for him at the time, but he thought that it would have made Reed smile. Rusty had had a strong sense of fairness. When Judd got married, he warned his bride-to-be about the nightmares and told her to wake him. They came unexpectedly, and for a few nights he could barely sleep, but then it would be fine for months. He went to one battalion reunion in 1950, but hated it because the men he had known had changed so much, because the nightmares were bad for weeks afterwards. After that, he avoided contact, although he read a lot about the war, and especially Normandy, trying to make sense of where he had been and what had happened. It all seemed much simpler and more coherent on a page than it had at the time. In 1967, he noticed the name James Taylor at the end of a television programme and wrote to the BBC. Months later, James wrote back and they began to correspond. In 1970, they began a tradition of meeting at Lord's for the Saturday of the Test match and watched the rest of the world side play England in the aftermath of the South African controversy. They met and talked of school and cricket and of their children. James had 2 girls and a boy, and Judd one of each. It did them both good. Over time, they talked a lot about Mark and the other friends taken by the war. James was a stalwart of his regimental association, a small band given its brief existence. Gradually, his influence convinced Bill Judd to get back in touch with the one for the Glamorgans. He attended a reunion in 1975 and had only a couple of nightmares in the aftermath. By 1980, he could go and enjoy it all and not dream at all. In 1984, he took his family to Normandy for the commemorations on the 40th anniversary. Coop Buchanan was there with his Rosemary. Unable to have any more children after his wound, they had adopted 5 more. Coop was proud of them all. James was also there, was approached by a spare, balding man. As soon as he heard the West Country burr, he recognised Collins. The voice had not changed in 40 years, but this was the first time he had involved himself in any way with the army and his past. Collins had simply gone back to working on the land and had never wanted to talk about the war with anyone. He'd been awarded an MM in Germany in March 1945, and not even his family knew about it. James put him in touch with Whitefield, who still lived in London and was a stalwart of Blesma, who had helped him in the early years as he struggled to cope with the loss of sight. James Taylor and Bill Judd were at Lord's in 2005 to watch as the England wickets tumbled in a year when they would take back the Ashes. Penny succumbed to cancer in the following winter, and James lived on for barely 5 weeks before dying in his sleep. Judd was at the back of the funeral, behind all the luminaries from TV. He never again went to Lord's or any test match, let alone the one-day abominations. He watched Glamorgan play at home when he got the chance, but refused to pay for satellite television, so listened rather than watched England play. In 2014 he made it to Normandy again on the 6th of June, but there were too few familiar faces and his age was catching up with him, and after that he never made another long journey. James had always taken the changing world in his stride. After the war, all that mattered was that he was alive and so fortunate in family and career. Judd was more resentful. The fame of Elvis puzzled him, and the hysteria of Beatlemania left him baffled and rather depressed. Even in middle age, he could not see a long-haired and scruffy youngster without having to fight back the urge to punch him in the face, or at least get him shaved and subject him to a couple of hours of close-order drill. Politics disgusted him. The vulgarity of popular culture angered him, so he did his best to ignore both. Instead, he did his best to moderate his quick temper and be kind, thoughtful, and helpful to everyone he met. He did not always succeed, but his wife helped him to do so more often than not. He died after a short illness in the autumn of 2015. So as I say, that's my take, and I'm quite proud of it as a piece of writing. I hope it reflects the very different experiences of the men who came back from the war and the scars, physical and mental, that they brought with them, but also how that generation did settle down, perhaps because there were more people out there who understood. Though even then, compared to, say, the First World War, far fewer people, even who'd been in uniform, had seen active service, and the scale of reserved occupations was larger. So, you read about resentment, and I've heard people talk of coming back to a job and finding the people that had stayed at home were now promoted over you and giving you orders, and often a difficult relationship, because with the best will in the world, they knew that the others had experienced something they had not, and it caused problems on both sides. And I think that's Gussie crying in the background. But those familiar with these YouTube videos will be familiar with Gussie and his frequent appearances, usually off stage, but nevertheless makes his presence felt. So I still think it was probably the right thing not to include it in the book, because in the one sense, whilst there's a sadness about what happens afterwards, there's also it's uplifting in the sense that, well, they got on with it, and that the main two and most of the others, as far as can be, had pleasant, happy lives afterwards. I wanted some pathos with Rusty Reed, because there are those people that you see and you come across in period after period that are worth their weight in gold in wartime, and yet can't fit in anywhere else, and society doesn't always cope with them very well, sometimes because perhaps it's difficult, but it's so the men who mattered, the ones who helped really win the war, but that gave them that sense of purpose. And there were many of that generation that you felt, unless they were very fortunate, life was never quite the same. It never quite lived up to the intensity and sense of purpose and the levels of friendships that they'd had during the forces. I remember my father saying that when you've depended for your life on other people in a civilian context, it's very hard to get that level of bond. It doesn't tend to come. So anyway, so that's my view of what happened afterwards. And as I say, not many people have read this. I think that's been read, other than myself, by about 3, possibly 4 people. Now it's up on the website. More will be able to, should they choose to. People will watch this video. I'll be interested to know what everybody thinks. A lot of them have said, oh no, you should have put this in, and all this sort of thing. I still think we were right not to, but it's not been one of those ones where I've been able to say absolutely certainly, yes, I think the novel is better without this, or it would be better with it. But anyway, that gives a sense of what happened next. There have been the odd comment, and I get periodic emails, people saying, well, I'd like to know what happened to Judd and all this sort of thing in particular, and how does it all end up for everybody. I think as well, I suspect my editors would have been reluctant to have it, because if you write a story that completes itself in the final chapter, then if it's suddenly staggeringly successful, then you can't write a sequel because you've already dealt with it. I've never seen this as a book that could have a sequel, anyway, not a direct sequel. I could write something similar, which I hope to do, about others and their experience of aspects of the Second World War, but this one, I wanted this just to be about Normandy, and to bring in the experiences of being conscripted, serving in the armed forces, of that great melting pot, but also, and the sense of the wider war and your life before then, but also it's about Normandy. That's why it doesn't go right to the end of the Battle for Normandy. It doesn't go through to the latter part of August. You don't get to Falaise, all this sort of thing. Because I thought I'd given a sense of the intensity of the fighting, the nature of the fighting, the experience for soldiers who overwhelmingly had seen no active service before this, and in many cases had never been abroad before this. So it's about those young British soldiers, and particularly this group, reflecting the tradition, as I say, from my old prep school here in South Wales. So anyway, so that's the epilogue of Hill 112. I hope it's of interest to some people. I'm hoping that more people will pick up the paperback. After all, it's It's quite an expense to buy a hardback novel. Everybody expects it's the paperback that really matters. That's when people will do it. And also the Kindle version, that over time I suspect the price of that, it's already pretty reasonable. Head of Zeus are very good in their pricing, but it'll probably drop again and there'll be offers. But as I've mentioned before, I'm very proud of this story. I think it's the most accurate thing I've written because I've got better material to go on. There's so much guesswork when you write about the Napoleonic world, or even the let alone the Roman world, where there's so many things we don't know. But this was something where I've tried to get it as close to the truth as I possibly can. So anyway, that's the unpublished, the previously unknown, the cut epilogue of Hill 112. Thanks for watching. Bye.